The Watchmaker of Forgotten Hours. On the morning Clara Vale found the shop that sold forgotten hours, every clock in Bellweather seemed to be running fast. The great clock above the exchange struck 9, while Clara was certain it could not yet be 8:30. The brass clock in the window of a tea merchant showed 17 minutes past 9. A carriage clock displayed beside a pawnbroker's silver candlesticks insisted it was nearly 10. Even Clara's own watch, which had belonged to her father and had never lost more than a minute in a month, appeared to be in a hurry. She stopped beneath the striped awning of a flower seller and held it to her ear. Tick, tick, tick. There was nothing unusual in the sound. Still, Clara had the peculiar feeling that the morning was escaping her. She closed the watch and slipped it into the pocket of her dark green coat. Bellweather was already busy around her. Cabs rolled over damp cobblestones. Shopkeepers swept their thresholds. Somewhere farther down Crown Street, a newspaper boy was calling out headlines in a voice far too cheerful for the hour. Smoke rose from 100 chimneys and flattened beneath a pale November sky. The city had been built in layers. There were broad avenues lined with stone banks and government offices, narrow commercial streets crowded with awnings and signs, and behind them, older neighborhoods where the houses leaned toward one another as though exchanging secrets. Clara knew Bellweather well. At least, she had always believed she did. For 11 years she had worked as an illustrator for Mr. Halloway's publishing house, drawing botanical plates, maps, diagrams of machinery, and occasionally the portraits of important men whose faces she privately thought were less interesting than the machinery. She walked nearly everywhere. She knew which bakery put its first loaves out before sunrise, which alley smelled permanently of oranges because a fruit merchant had once kept his warehouse there, and which churchyard contained a stone bench that remained warm long after the afternoon sun had left it. Yet that morning, while taking a shortcut between Crown Street and Harrow Lane, Clara discovered a passage she had never seen. It opened between a tailor's shop and a narrow building occupied by a solicitor. There was no street sign, only a paved lane, scarcely wide enough for a carriage, descending gently between old brick walls. Clara stopped. She had passed this place hundreds of times. There had been a wall here. She was almost certain of it. But she was already late, and curiosity was one of the few habits she had never managed to cure. So she turned into the lane. The noise of Crown Street faded surprisingly quickly. At the bottom stood 3 shops, a bookbinder, a seller of umbrellas, and a watchmaker. The watchmaker's window was dusty. There were no prices displayed and no advertisements promising repairs while one waited. Instead, perhaps 30 clocks filled the window, mantel clocks, pocket watches, carriage clocks, a porcelain clock painted with blue flowers, a wooden clock shaped like a little house, and one tall silver clock with no numbers at all. None showed the same time. Clara leaned closer. One read 3 minutes past 2, another 27 minutes after 6. A tiny brass watch had stopped at 11:42. The clock with blue flowers showed 4:18. There was something deliberate about those times. Not one stood neatly at 12. Not one appeared arranged for display. Then Clara noticed the words painted on the glass, M. Orren Watchmaker, and beneath that, in much smaller lettering, Hours Recovered. Clara smiled despite herself. It was exactly the sort of theatrical nonsense Bellweather shopkeepers used to attract customers. Umbrellas for every storm, shoes for every road, tea for every temper. Hours recovered. She was about to leave when something moved inside the shop. Not a person, a pendulum. It belonged to a clock at the very back. Clara could see only part of it through the cluttered window. Dark walnut case, small brass face, a painted ring of white jasmine flowers. Her breath caught. For several seconds she remained perfectly still. Then she opened the door. A bell gave a single soft note. The shop smelled of beeswax, metal, old wood, and black tea. Clocks covered nearly every wall, but the room was not noisy. Clara had expected a frantic chorus of ticking. Instead, she heard only a few. Some clocks were silent. Some moved without sound. Others ticked slowly, almost thoughtfully. Behind a workbench sat an old man wearing a brown waistcoat and spectacles with round lenses. He was repairing a pocket watch beneath a green-shaded lamp. Without looking up, he said, "You're early." Clara glanced behind herself. "I beg your pardon?" The old man lifted his eyes. His hair was white and rather wild, but his face was gentle. "Ah," he said, "perhaps not." "Not what?" "Early." He returned to the watch. Clara waited. Eventually she said, "Are you Mr. Orren?" "Usually." "Usually?" "It is what most people call me." Clara decided that watchmakers, like artists and pharmacists, were permitted a certain amount of eccentricity. She stepped farther inside. "I'm sorry to bother you. I noticed a clock in the window." "That is encouraging." "The walnut one." "Less encouraging. I have 7 walnut clocks. The one painted with jasmine." Mr. Orren's hand stopped, only for an instant. Then he placed his screwdriver carefully on the bench. "I see." Clara felt suddenly foolish. "My mother had a clock like it." "Did she?" "Almost exactly." Mr. Orren studied her. "What was your mother's name?" The question was unexpectedly personal. Clara hesitated. "Eleanor Vale." The old man removed his spectacles. For the first time, he seemed fully awake. "Eleanor." Clara's skin prickled. "You knew her?" Mr. Orren looked toward the back of the shop. "No," he said after a moment, "but I knew her hour." Clara stared at him. "I'm afraid I don't understand." "No," he said quietly. "People rarely do at first." He stood. He was taller than she had expected and walked with the slight stiffness of someone who had spent many years bent over small machinery. "Come." He led her between shelves crowded with clocks. The jasmine clock stood near a curtain at the back. Up close, Clara saw that it was not identical to her mother's clock, but it was very close. Her mother had kept a walnut mantel clock in the sitting room of their old house. Jasmine flowers had been painted around the dial because Eleanor Vale loved the scent of jasmine, though the plant rarely survived Bellweather winters. After her mother's death, the clock had disappeared. Clara had assumed it had been sold with other household things. She touched the edge of the wooden case. The hands showed 6:14. Her heart gave one heavy beat. "Why that time?" she asked. Mr. Orren did not answer. Clara looked at him. "Why 6:14? Because that is the hour it keeps." "That isn't an hour. It's a minute. The beginning of one." Clara turned back to the clock. November vanished. For an instant she remembered summer, an open window, white curtains lifting in warm air, her mother's hands dusted with flour, her father's laugh from somewhere in the garden, and Daniel sitting on the low wall beneath the pear tree, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. "Daniel." Clara stepped away from the clock. She had not spoken his name aloud in years. Mr. Orren watched her without surprise. "What is this place?" she whispered. "A watchmaker's." "Please don't." He sighed. "Would you like tea?" "No." "Most explanations improve with tea." "I would like an answer." "Those are less reliable." Clara almost left. Instead, she heard herself laugh. It was a small, unwilling laugh, but it broke something in the room. Mr. Orren smiled. "Tea, then." This time Clara agreed. He prepared it on a little iron stove behind the curtain. Beyond the curtain was another room containing hundreds of drawers. Each had a brass label. Some bore names, others dates. A few contained only a single word: harvest, departure, first snow, Tuesday. Clara noticed one labeled Eleanor Vale. She did not mention it. Mr. Orren poured tea into 2 mismatched cups. "Time," he said, "is generally misunderstood." Clara wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "By watchmakers?" "Especially by watchmakers." He sat opposite her. "People think clocks measure time. They do not. They measure repetition. A pendulum swings, a spring unwinds, a wheel turns. We count the movements and call the result time. And these clocks measure something else." "What?" he considered. "Attachment, perhaps." Clara frowned. Mr. Orren pointed toward the shop. "Every clock out there holds an hour that somebody could not entirely leave behind." Clara waited for him to smile. He did not. "You're saying they contain memories." "Not exactly. Memory changes every time we visit it. These are rather more stubborn. Then what do they contain? An hour. An actual hour. Actual is a troublesome word." Clara put down her tea. "I should go." "Probably." She stood, then looked again toward the jasmine clock. 6:14. "Whose hour is that?" Mr. Orren's expression softened. "Yours." Clara did not return to the publishing house that morning. She walked for nearly 2 hours instead. Across Bellweather Bridge, along the river, through the market where chestnut sellers were lighting their braziers. She told herself Mr. Orren was a fraud. A clever fraud, perhaps. Someone who had known her mother. Someone who had learned her name. But 6:14, that was harder to explain because Clara remembered 6:14. Not from a clock. from a railway timetable. 17 years earlier, Daniel Arden had been due to leave Bellweather on the 6:14 train to Meryton. He had been 27. Clara had been 25. They had known each other since childhood. They had also spent 3 years pretending they were merely friends. Daniel had been offered work restoring paintings in a cathedral on the coast. He was to be gone for a year, perhaps two. On his final afternoon in Bellweather, he came to Clara's parents' house. They sat beneath the pear tree. He talked about the coast. She talked about her work. Neither said what mattered. At last, Daniel had looked at her and said, "Clara asked me to stay." She had thought he was joking. Then she saw his face. She had wanted to say it, more than anything. But Clara had been young enough to believe that love should arrive with certainty. So she said, "You should go." Daniel nodded. He left for the station. The 6:14 departed without her. 3 months later, a letter arrived. Daniel had decided to remain in Meryton. Then another letter, then another. Clara answered some, not all. Years passed, her mother died, her father followed 5 winters later. Daniel eventually stopped writing, and Clara became very good at living a respectable, useful, reasonably pleasant life. She did not consider herself unhappy. That was important. She had friends, work she enjoyed, a comfortable apartment overlooking a courtyard where sparrows gathered each morning. She traveled occasionally. She laughed often. She had even loved another man for a while, though not enough to marry him. Yet some evenings, particularly in late summer, when the air smelled faintly of pears, Clara found herself wondering what would have happened if she had gone to the station. At noon, she returned to Crown Street. The passage was still there. So was the shop. Mr. Ruff. Orren looked up as she entered. "I thought you might come back. You knew Daniel Arden." "No." "My parents, then." "No." "How do you know about 6:14? "I don't." Clara placed both hands on his workbench. "You said the clock belonged to me." "It does." "Then tell me what it is." Mr. Orren regarded her for a long moment. Finally he rose. He carried the jasmine clock to a small table. "Sit." Clara did. Mr. Orren produced a tiny brass key. "There are rules." "Of course there are." "Do not try to change anything." Clara's irritation vanished. "What do you mean?" "You may experience the hour. You cannot alter it." "Experience it how?" "As you experienced it then." Clara stared at him. "This is impossible." "Yes." He inserted the key. "That has never prevented much." He wound the clock once. A soft click came from inside. "Close your eyes," he said. Clara did. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then she smelled jasmine. Not strongly, just a trace. Warm air touched her face. Somewhere nearby, a spoon struck the rim of a glass. Clara opened her eyes. She was sitting beneath the pear tree. Summer sunlight lay across the grass. The house stood behind her exactly as it had 17 years earlier, before her father replaced the shutters and before her mother planted roses along the kitchen wall. Daniel sat beside her, young Daniel, brown hair falling over his forehead, sleeves rolled to the elbow. There was blue paint on his thumb. Clara could not breathe. Daniel smiled. "You've gone very quiet." She remembered this. Every word, every movement. She was not watching the memory. She was inside it. Yet her younger self seemed to move without instruction. "I was thinking," she heard herself say. "Dangerous." "Very." Daniel smiled. He looked toward the house. Through the open kitchen window, Clara's mother was singing. Clara had forgotten that. Not the song. The fact that her mother sang while baking. Tears filled Clara's eyes. Daniel did not notice. Or rather, the Daniel of 17 years ago had not noticed. He picked up his lemonade. "I'll miss this garden. You always complained about the mosquitoes. I'll miss complaining about them. You'll find coastal mosquitoes. Not Bellweather mosquitoes. Ours have character." Clara laughed. She remembered that too. Then Daniel's expression changed. The moment was coming. She wanted to stop it. She could not. "Clara." "Yes?" "Ask me to stay." There it was. The entire world seemed balanced on 4 words. Clara felt her old fear. She understood it now. She had been afraid that if she asked and Daniel stayed, his happiness would become her responsibility. She had been afraid that love would close the world rather than enlarge it. So her younger voice answered, "You should go." Daniel looked down. A pear leaf turned slowly in the afternoon breeze. Then he smiled, though the smile did not quite reach his eyes. "Perhaps I should." The garden dissolved. Clara opened her eyes. The watchmaker's shop returned. The clock showed 7:14. Exactly 1 hour had passed on its face, yet outside, the same cart was rolling past the window. Perhaps a minute had passed. Clara wiped her cheeks. Mr. Orren quietly pushed a handkerchief across the table. I had forgotten her singing, Clara said. He nodded. I thought the hour was about Daniel. Was it? Clara looked at the jasmine clock. No, not entirely. That surprised her. She had expected regret. Instead, what remained strongest was her mother's voice drifting from the kitchen. The sunlight, her father's hat lying on the garden wall, Daniel's paint-stained thumb, the taste of lemonade, life before she knew it was becoming memory. Can I do it again? Mr. Orren shook his head. Not today. Tomorrow? Perhaps. What happens if I keep returning? His expression became serious. That depends on whether you are visiting the past or moving into it. Over the following weeks, Clara became a regular visitor. At first, she came for the jasmine clock. Then she became interested in the others. There was a small copper watch belonging to a baker named Mrs. Pell, preserving the hour her twin sons had returned unexpectedly from university. A black carriage clock held the last evening an elderly professor and his wife had danced together in their kitchen. A cheap tin watch preserved a summer afternoon when a dock worker aged 12 had learned to swim. Not all the hours were grand. In fact, almost none were. A breakfast, a conversation, a walk home through snow, a baby's first laugh, an afternoon fishing with a brother, the final cup of tea shared with a grandmother. Clara began helping Mr. Orren. Not officially. She simply stayed longer each time. She dusted shelves, made tea, recorded repairs. Because of her skill as an illustrator, she began drawing the more unusual mechanisms in a large ledger. The clocks fascinated her. Their interiors should not have worked. Some contained extra gears that connected to nothing. Others had springs made from metals Clara could not identify. One tiny watch contained a wheel that turned backward while every other wheel moved forward. Who made these? She asked one evening. Mr. Orren was polishing a brass case. Various people. Who made the first? He stopped polishing. I did. Clara looked up. When? A long time ago. How long? Long enough to regret the design. She smiled. Which clock was it? Mr. Orren pointed toward a shelf. There stood a plain wooden clock. It had no decoration. Its hands showed 8:31. Whose hour? Mr. Orren returned to polishing. Mine. Clara waited. He said nothing more. Winter settled over Bellweather. Frost whitened rooftops. The river moved dark and slow beneath the bridges. Clara continued her ordinary work by day and visited the shop several evenings each week. She noticed something strange. Customers rarely arrived by accident. They entered hesitantly, often carrying an object. A ribbon, a photograph, a button, a dried flower. Mr. Orren would listen to them. Sometimes he accepted the object. Sometimes he did not. One evening a gentleman brought his dead wife's glove and begged Mr. Orren to recover their wedding morning. Mr. Orren refused. Why? Clara asked after the man had gone. He didn't want the mourning. What did he want? His wife. Clara understood. Another woman came carrying a child's wooden horse. Mr. Orren listened to her for nearly an hour. Then he made a clock. Clara watched. He placed the horse beside him. He selected a brass mechanism. He worked without speaking. When the clock was complete, its hands settled at 2:43. How do you know the time? Clara asked. I don't. Then how? The clock does. She had grown accustomed to answers like that, but she had also begun to notice something about Mr. Orren. He was tired. Not ordinarily tired, something deeper. His hands sometimes trembled. He forgot to eat, and each time a new clock was created, he seemed older afterward. One snowy evening, Clara arrived and found him asleep at the bench. The plain wooden clock stood beside his hand. 8:31. She approached it. For weeks she had wondered. Now in the quiet shop, temptation became stronger than manners. The key lay nearby. Clara picked it up. Don't! Mr. Orren's eyes were open. She froze. I'm sorry. Curiosity is rarely improved by apology. You've been avoiding the question. Yes? Why? Because some answers are heavier when shared. Clara put down the key. Then don't tell me. Mr. Orren studied her. Something in his face softened. My wife's name was Ada. Clara sat opposite him. We were married 46 years. He looked toward the wooden clock. She made clocks too, better than I did. Was this hers? No, mine. Snow whispered against the window. Mr. Orren folded his hands. Ada became ill. Slowly. There was nothing dramatic about it. That made it harder in some ways. We had time to understand what was happening. He paused. On her final morning, she woke before dawn. At 8:31, she asked me to open the window. Clara listened. It was spring. There were sparrows on the roof opposite. Someone downstairs was baking bread. Ada said the air smelled wonderful. His smile was faint. Then she said, "Martin, don't make a clock of this." Clara glanced toward the wooden clock. Mr. Orren nodded. "I promised." "Oh, yes." He leaned back. "I kept the promise for 3 days." Clara said nothing. "I told myself I only wanted to hear her voice again. Then I wanted the whole hour, so I built the first clock." "Did it work?" "Perfectly." His eyes moved to the clock. That was the problem. He returned to the hour the next day, and the next, then twice in one day. Each visit felt real. Ada beside him, the spring air, the smell of bread. For months he lived more faithfully in that hour than in the days surrounding him. "Eventually," he said, "I realized I was forgetting everything else." Clara frowned. "Forgetting?" "Our wedding, journeys we took, arguments, Christmas mornings, the ridiculous yellow hat she wore for 6 years because she believed it suited her." His voice trembled with amusement. "I remembered only the final hour." The preserved memory had become too bright. Everything around it faded. "So you stopped?" "I tried." "Did you?" "Eventually." He looked around the shop. By then I had learned that other people carried hours too. Some begged to recover them. I thought perhaps I could make better use of what I discovered. Clara understood something then. The clocks aren't meant to keep the hours forever. Mr. Orren looked at her. "No." "What happens to them?" "When someone no longer needs the hour, the clock stops. And then I take it apart." Clara thought of the jasmine clock. "Mine hasn't stopped." "No." "Because I still need it? Or because you believe you do?" Christmas approached. Bellweather brightened. Evergreen garlands appeared above shop doors. Brass bands played in public squares. Bakers displayed sugared cakes and ginger biscuits. Clara visited her old family house. She had not gone there in years. A doctor and his family lived there now. The pear tree remained. From the pavement she could see its bare branches above the wall. Clara stood outside for a long time. Then someone behind her said, "I wondered whether that was you." She turned. For one impossible second, she thought the jasmine clock had opened without her. Daniel Arden stood on the pavement. Older. Of course older. There was silver at his temples now, and the boyish thinness had left his face, but his eyes were the same. "Daniel." "Hello, Clara." They stared at each other. Then both laughed. It was easier after that. They went to a nearby cafe. Daniel had returned to Bellweather 6 months earlier. His father had died, leaving him the family apartment. He had spent years restoring paintings along the coast, then in Italy, then France. He had married. Clara felt something tighten inside her. Then Daniel said, "Her name was Sophie. She died 4 years ago." "I'm sorry, thank you." He looked down at his coffee. "We had 12 good years." Clara meant it when she said, "I'm glad." Daniel smiled. "So am I." They talked for 2 hours, not about what might have been. Not at first. They talked about work, cities, parents, people they had known. Daniel told her about Sophie, carefully at first, then warmly when he realized Clara did not mind. Clara told him about her illustrations. Eventually, the old summer afternoon entered the conversation. "I was terribly dramatic," Daniel said. "You asked me to determine your entire future beneath a pear tree. I was 27, a dangerous age. I thought you were going to ask me to stay. I nearly did." Daniel looked at her. Clara felt no need to hide anymore. "I loved you." He smiled sadly. "I know. You knew?" "Clara, everyone knew." She laughed. "My mother, especially your mother. Why didn't anyone tell me?" "We assumed you knew too." They sat in comfortable silence. Then Daniel said, "For years I wondered what would have happened." "So did I." "And?" Clara looked through the cafe window. Snow had begun falling. "I don't know." Daniel nodded. "Neither do I." Strangely, that answer felt better than certainty. They walked together as far as the river. Before parting, Daniel said, "Would you have dinner with me sometime?" Clara looked at him. "This isn't another railway station, is it?" He laughed. "No, just dinner." "Then yes." That evening, Clara went to Mr. Orren's shop. The jasmine clock had stopped. 7:14, she stood before it. Mr. Orren appeared beside her. "You saw him." "How do you know?" "I don't." She gave him a look. He smiled. "Your clock stopped." Clara touched the painted flowers. "Can I enter the hour once more?" "You could. But there is always a but." She thought of her mother singing, her father in the garden. Young Daniel, the sunlight. Then she shook her head. No, Mr. Orren nodded. Together they carried the clock to his bench. He handed Clara a screwdriver. What? You've been drawing mechanisms for 2 months. Surely you've learned something. You want me to dismantle it? It is your hour. Clara hesitated, then removed the first screw. Inside were ordinary gears, brass, steel, a spring, nothing magical. She almost laughed. Piece by piece, the clock came apart. When they finished, Mr. Orren placed the empty walnut case before her. What happens now? Anything you like, Clara thought. Could we make another clock? An ordinary one? Yes, Mr. Orren smiled. The best kind. They worked until midnight. When the clock was finished, Clara painted jasmine flowers around the face, but this time the hands moved, steadily, forward. Daniel and Clara had dinner 3 nights later, then again in January. There was no grand declaration, no attempt to recover their youth. They were no longer 25 and 27, and both seemed relieved by that. They became friends again first. That mattered. Daniel visited Clara's studio and criticized her habit of leaving brushes and teacups. Clara visited his workshop and discovered he talked to paintings while restoring them. They walked beside the river. They attended concerts. Sometimes they spoke about Sophie, sometimes about Clara's parents. Sometimes they spoke about nothing important at all. Spring came gradually. One March afternoon, Clara arrived at the watchmaker's shop and found the door locked. A note had been placed inside the window. Miss Vale, key under the blue flower pot. Tea in the tin. Do not touch the French clock. M.O. Clara found the key. Inside, everything appeared normal, except Mr. Orren was gone. His coat was gone, too. So was the plain wooden clock. Clara waited. An hour. Then 2. He did not return. The following morning, the shop remained empty. On the 3rd day, Clara opened the drawer labeled Martin Orren. Inside was a photograph. Mr. Orren as a young man. Beside him stood a woman with dark hair and an amused smile. Ada. Behind them was the shop, exactly the same shop. Clara turned the photograph over. In faded ink, opening day 1841. Clara stared at the date. That was impossible. Mr. Orren would have needed to be nearly 100 years old. Behind the photograph lay a note. Clara unfolded it. Only a few lines. You asked where the clocks came from. The answer is simpler than you hoped. They came from grief, workmanship, and a mistake. Most useful things come from some combination of the 3. The shop is yours if you want it, but please remember, we do not save time. We return it. M.P.S. The French clock really is dreadful. Clara laughed and cried at the same time. Then she saw something beneath the note. A small brass key. She knew immediately which clock it belonged to. But the wooden clock was gone. Clara searched everywhere. Nothing. Weeks passed. Mr. Orren did not return. No one on the lane remembered seeing him leave. The umbrella seller claimed the watchmaker's shop had been there longer than his grandfather's business. The bookbinder insisted it had opened only 15 years earlier. City records were equally useless. There was no Martin Orren listed as the owner. There was, however, an Ada Orren, watchmaker, registered proprietor. 1841, Clara found one more thing. Ada Orren had lived until 1887, 32 years longer than Martin Orren. Clara sat in the records office, staring at the page. Then she understood, or thought she did. That evening she returned to the shop. She opened the drawer labeled Ada Orren. It was empty. Clara sat behind the workbench. The clocks surrounded her, hundreds of preserved hours. Perhaps Mr. Orren had never survived Ada. Perhaps he had been the one who died first. Perhaps the wooden clock had belonged to Ada. Perhaps 8:31 preserved not the hour of her death, but his. The mystery could have frightened Clara. Instead, it felt strangely tender, a promise broken, an hour preserved, a watchmaker remaining long enough to help others understand what he himself had struggled to learn. She never discovered the full truth. Eventually, she stopped trying. Some truths, she decided, did not become better when forced into perfect shape. By summer, the sign outside changed. M. Orren became C. Vale watchmaker. Daniel painted the lettering. You aren't a watchmaker, he pointed out. I'm learning. From whom? Clara looked around the shop. Several people. Daniel did not ask. He had learned that Clara's answers sometimes required patience. She continued illustrating books 3 days a week. The rest of her time she spent in the shop. She repaired ordinary clocks. Those were the majority. People arrived with broken springs, cracked faces, missing hands, and mechanisms clogged by decades of dust. Clara liked ordinary repairs. There was satisfaction in returning movement to something meant to move. Occasionally, however, someone arrived carrying an object, a photograph, a ribbon, a dried flower, and Clara would know. At first, she did not understand how to make the special clocks. Then one afternoon, an elderly woman brought a smooth gray stone. My sister and I collected these beside the sea, she explained. There was one afternoon. Clara listened. That was all. She listened. Something inside the shop seemed to listen with her. Later, while examining a small brass mechanism, Clara noticed an extra wheel. She had not put it there. The clock's hands settled at 3:22. Clara smiled. "All right," she whispered. And so the work continued. She established her own rules. No one could recover an hour merely to avoid the present. No one could use a clock to win an argument with the dead. No one could change what had happened. And every visitor was warned that memories were doors, not houses. Daniel approved of that rule. By autumn, he had a key to the shop. Their relationship changed slowly. So slowly that Clara could not have identified the day friendship became love again. Perhaps it happened during a picnic beside the river. Perhaps while Daniel repaired a shelf. Perhaps when he fell asleep in the chair beside the stove and Clara covered him with her coat. There was no 6:14 this time. No single minute on which everything depended. That pleased her. One evening, nearly a year after Mr. Orren disappeared, Clara and Daniel were closing the shop. Outside, Bellweather glowed beneath the soft blue light of early winter. Daniel was fastening the shutters when Clara heard a clock strike. Once. She turned. None of the clocks should have chimed. Again. A second note. The sound came from the back room. Clara followed it. On the workbench stood a plain wooden clock. Her heart stopped. 8:31. Daniel came behind her. Was that there before? No, the brass key lay beside it. Clara picked it up. She knew what the clock contained. Not exactly, but enough. Do you want me to stay? Daniel asked. She looked at him. Yes. He pulled over 2 chairs. Clara inserted the key. One turn. The clock began ticking. She closed her eyes. Spring air. Sparrows. Fresh bread. Clara opened her eyes. She stood inside the old shop. Sunlight filled the window. A younger Mr. Orren stood at the workbench. Not young exactly. Perhaps 50. Beside him was Ada, older than the woman in the photograph. Her hair was streaked with silver. Clara understood immediately. This was Ada's hour. Mr. Orren was packing a small case. "You'll miss the train," Ada said. "I have never missed a train. You missed our honeymoon train. That was deliberate. You arrived at the station carrying fishing rods. A misunderstanding." Ada laughed. Clara felt Daniel beside her, though neither of them belonged to the scene. Mr. Orren buttoned his coat, then looked at Ada. 8:31. What? The time. Why does it matter? I want to remember it. Ada crossed the room. She touched his face. "Martin, if you spend your life remembering every good moment, you'll miss the next one." He smiled. "That sounds annoyingly wise." "I've practiced." They kissed, a simple married kiss. Then Mr. Orren picked up his case. At the door he turned. "Ada? Yes? I'll be back Thursday. I know." He left. Ada stood by the window watching him walk down the lane. The hours shifted. Minutes passed. A knock came at the door. A policeman entered. Clara did not hear the words. She did not need to. Ada sat down. The policeman removed his hat. Outside, bells began ringing somewhere across Bellweather. The scene softened, but it did not end. Clara expected grief to dominate the hour. Instead, something unexpected happened. Ada rose. She walked to Martin's workbench. There lay a half-finished clock. She sat before it. She sat before it. For a long time she did nothing. Then she picked up a screwdriver. The hour ended. Clara opened her eyes. The wooden clock had stopped. 9:31. Daniel was silent. "So," he said eventually, "Ada made the first clock." Clara nodded. "For Martin?" "Yes." "And Martin was the hour." They sat together. Clara thought about the old watchmaker. Had the clock somehow preserved more than memory? Had Ada recovered Martin's hour so often that some part of him remained? Had love, repeated enough times, learned to wind its own mechanism? She would never know. But she understood why he had stayed. He had spent decades helping strangers leave the past because Ada had once spent years learning how to do the same. Eventually, perhaps, the lesson had become his too. Clara took apart the wooden clock the next morning. Inside she found a tiny inscription scratched into one brass wheel. A+M. Nothing else. She kept that wheel. Not in a clock. In the drawer where she stored pencils. Years passed. Bellweather changed. Electric lights appeared on the larger avenues. Motor cars began startling horses. Buildings rose. Old shops vanished. The narrow lane remained. So did Clara's watchmaker shop. Daniel eventually moved his restoration studio into the room above it. They married on a mild September morning with very little ceremony and an excessive amount of cake. Clara wore jasmine in her hair, not because of the clock, because she liked jasmine. That distinction mattered. They never had children, though their life was far from empty. There were nieces, friends, apprentices, customers. Sunday dinners that somehow grew from 4 people to 12. There were disagreements, illnesses, bills, burned dinners, wonderful journeys, tedious Tuesdays. There were years when business prospered and years when it did not. There were mornings when Clara woke beside Daniel and felt astonished by happiness. There were other mornings when he snored. Life, she discovered, was less like a preserved hour than a workshop full of clocks. Some ran fast, some slow, some stopped unexpectedly, some required repair, and none could be understood by staring only at the hands. When Clara was 68, Daniel became ill. Not suddenly. They had time. That was both gift and burden. One spring morning they sat together outside a cafe overlooking the river. Bellweather had changed enormously. Daniel stirred his tea. "You could make one," he said. Clara knew what he meant. "A clock? For today." She looked at him. "Do you want me to?" he thought, then shook his head. "No, neither do I." "Good." He reached across the table. She took his hand. They watched boats moving beneath the bridge. Nothing remarkable happened. A dog barked at pigeons. A waiter dropped a spoon. Somewhere a child was laughing. Daniel complained that his tea was weak. Clara told him he complained about all tea. He denied it. She reminded him of several examples. He accused her of maintaining unnecessary historical records. She laughed. Months later, after Daniel was gone, Clara remembered that morning often. But she never made a clock for it. She did not need to. Grief came. She allowed it. Memory came too. Not 1 hour, thousands. Daniel asleep beside the stove. Daniel painting the shop sign. Daniel at 27 beneath a pear tree. Daniel at 44 drinking coffee after 17 years apart. Daniel at 70 asking whether there were any biscuits left. No single memory swallowed the others. That was the gift Mr. Orren had left her. Or perhaps Ada had. Years afterward, on a bright October afternoon, a young woman entered the shop carrying a red scarf. Clara was 81. Her hair was white now. She wore round spectacles. The young woman looked nervous. "Are you Clara Vale?" "Usually." The young woman blinked. Clara smiled. An old joke. A very old joke. "I was told you make unusual clocks." "Sometimes." The woman held the scarf tightly. "My father died last winter." Clara nodded. "There was an afternoon," the woman continued. "We were walking near the harbor. Nothing important happened. We bought roasted almonds. He told me a story I'd heard 100 times. I was impatient with him." Her voice shook. "I would give anything to have that hour again." Clara looked at the scarf, then at the woman. "Sit down." She put the kettle on. Most explanations improve with tea. Outside, autumn sunlight moved across the narrow lane. Inside, clocks ticked, some ordinary, some not. Clara listened to the young woman tell her story. As she listened, one of the mechanisms in the drawer beside her gave a small metallic click. A new wheel had appeared. Clara smiled. She understood now that forgotten hours were not truly forgotten. They waited in gestures, in smells, in ordinary objects kept for reasons no one could explain, in recipes remembered by the hands, in jokes repeated by children who never met the person who first told them, in songs hummed without remembering where they were learned. Time did not vanish as completely as clocks suggested, nor could it be kept. That evening, after the young woman had gone, Clara closed the shop. The city beyond the window was turning gold. She walked slowly to the doorway. Above the workbench hung the jasmine clock. It had been there for decades. An ordinary clock now. Its face was scratched. The painted flowers had faded, but it kept excellent time. 6:13. Clara watched the minute hand move. A quiet click. 6:14. Once, that minute had seemed like a door closing forever. Now it was simply a minute. It arrived. It stayed. It passed. Clara put on her coat and stepped outside. The lane smelled of bread from the bakery that had replaced the umbrella shop. Somewhere above the rooftops, bells began striking 6. People hurried home. Windows brightened one by one. A boy rode past on a bicycle, laughing. A woman carrying flowers stopped to speak with a neighbor. Steam rose from a street vendor's cart. Bellweather continued without asking anyone's permission. Clara locked the door. For a moment she thought of Martin Orren, then Ada, her mother singing in the kitchen, her father in the garden, young Daniel beneath the pear tree, older Daniel beside the river. She carried them all, but none pulled her backward. At the end of the lane, Clara turned. In the darkening shop window, the clocks were visible behind the glass. Dozens of faces, dozens of hours. For just an instant she thought she saw Mr. Orren standing among them in his brown waistcoat. Beside him was a silver-haired woman. Ada, perhaps. They appeared to be arguing cheerfully over a pocket watch. Then a carriage passed. When Clara looked again, the shop was empty. She smiled. "Good night, Martin." She walked on. At home she made soup. She opened a window despite the cold. She read for a while in Daniel's old chair and discovered one of his pencils beneath the cushion. She placed it on the table rather than in a drawer. Later, the bells of Bellweather marked another hour. Clara barely noticed. The sound drifted across the rooftops and faded into the ordinary evening noises of the city. Somewhere, someone was meeting the person they would love. Someone else was saying goodbye. A family was sitting down to dinner. A baker was pulling warm loaves from an oven. A tired nurse was walking home. A child was hearing an old story for the first time. Thousands upon thousands of hours were passing through Bellweather. Most would never be placed inside clocks. Most would never need to be. They would live where hours had always lived best. Not behind glass, not inside brass wheels, not waiting for someone to turn a key, but scattered gently through the people who had been there, changing shape as the years went by, becoming stories, habits, laughter, kindness, and occasionally a sudden remembered scent of jasmine on an ordinary evening. And in the narrow lane between two streets, the old clock above Clara Vale's workbench continued its patient work. Tick, 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 always forward, always onward. Keeping nothing, losing nothing, simply making room for the hour that came next.